Hello all and welcome, and I am the MGTOW Philosopher. And in this video, I would like to make the case for male feminism being a form of soft Stockholm syndrome. Now, what I mean when I say soft is that it's not as extreme as full-blown Stockholm syndrome where somebody's grabbed, taken hostage, every little tiny detail of their existence is controlled until they come to essentially sympathize and form a close relationship with their captor because of that. No, what I'm talking about is a softer form, but in my mind still qualifies as Stockholm syndrome. And I think you'll see that when I'm done, I will have made my case, and that most of you, if not all of you, will agree with me that male feminists are sufferers of Stockholm syndrome. Now, I'm going to make my case by doing a point-by-point comparison with the most well-known case of a Stockholm syndrome sufferer, and that is Patty Hearst. So what I'd like to do is outline her captivity and what brought her to be someone who not only sympathized but identified with her captors and became one of them, just like a male feminist does. Now, I'm not going to get into a great deal of specificity in regards to the things Patty Hearst's captors did to her that she said they did, because some of the things that they did are not part of what's required to develop Stockholm syndrome, and it would just muddy the water somewhat. So let me go over the actual original case, and I will go over some of the specifics, but not all of them, because some of what happened to her is irrelevant to the development of Stockholm syndrome. Now, what a lot of people don't know is that this syndrome was actually first diagnosed, and the diagnoses developed in Sweden. Yeah, that's right, Sweden. So let's start with a description of that, a short description of that incident. So while the term is widely known, the incident that led to its coinage remains relatively obscure. Outside Sweden, few know the names of bank workers Birgitta Lundblad, Elizabeth Oldgren, Kristen Enmark, and Sven Svafstrom. You're going to have to forgive me if I totally bastardize their names. I'm not too good at foreign names. It was the 23rd of August, 1973, when the four were taken hostage in the Kreditbanken by 32-year-old career criminal Jan Erik Olsen, who was later joined at the bank by a former prison mate. 6 days later, when the standoff ended, it became evident that the victims had formed some kind of positive relationship with their captors. Now, this is the key. They have to be captors of yours. So some of you might be saying, well, kids aren't captors of their parents. Oh, no? Where else can they go? Right, they can't go anywhere. Children are, in essence, soft captors. Yeah, okay, they weren't kidnapped by anybody, but they can't go anyway. You are the one who's holding them. Not only them hostage, but they are your captor in a sense. No question about that. It continues to say, Stockholm Syndrome was born by way of explanation. The phrase was reported to have been coined by criminologist and psychiatrist Niels Bejerot. Psychiatrist Dr. Frank Åkerberg was intrigued by the phenomenon and went on to define the syndrome for the FBI and Scotland Yard in the 1970s. At the time, he was helping the U.S. National Task Force on Terrorism and Disorder devise strategies for hostage situations. His criteria, now these are very important. We have to draw some parallels here between this and male feminists and their childhoods, because the majority of male feminists are raised by single mothers. Imagine that. His criteria included the following. First, people would experience something terrifying that just comes at them out of the blue. They are certain they are going to die. Now, of course, this is an extreme example, and the evident threat of death is not existent in most single-parent households, of course, but fear is. So this is just an extreme form of fear. And male children growing up being raised by female feminists, which is two or more or less the same thing, by single mothers, essentially are from a very early age going to know about fear because these people are angry. Single mothers are angry. Now, we all know that women are very emotional creatures, and if they're dumped once or twice by a man, or if things don't work out once or twice with a man, unlike a man who can let go and say, meh, no big deal, move on to the next one. Women can't do that. They get angry and bitter, and they need a surrogate for that anger, and there you have it. The exemplification of the very man who screwed them over and even looks like him. And they will take it all out on him, and that will, from a very early age, inspire a similar fear. And, of course, with a child, the type of fear that can be inspired by this angry, wacko, feminist mommy, man-hater, freaking out on her son, can inspire a similar type of fear. So already we have met criteria number 1. Intense fear inspired in your captor. A fear of you, a fear of what they could do to you, constantly being nervous and on edge around them because of what they might do, never knowing what they're going to do next. Number 2, then they experience a type of infantilization. Interesting. So the person infantilizes, the meaning treats them as if they were a child. Well, once you're a child, you're already being infantilized. So boom, right there. Where, like a child, they are unable to eat, speak, or go to the toilet without permission. This is very interesting. And this is why I coined the term soft Stockholm Syndrome, because clearly this is not like a full-blown case where you've been taken hostage and every little tiny movement, every little action that you make is controlled by your captor. Obviously not. Obviously, these boys' mothers are not, in most cases, monitoring every little tiny thing they do, but they are overly critical and overly authoritarian in most cases. That is for sure. So criteria 2 is met. Okay? Yes, and by the way, male children of feminists, yes, do tend to be infantilized, even as children. And by the way, it's very interesting how many of these articles I read about these male feminists, they talk heavily about abuse. They talk heavily about abuse, which could only have been at the hands of their mothers, who they don't say a bad word about when they're talking about it. Interesting. No? Patty Hearst suffered abuse as well while she was in captivity. I'll get to that more later on. Let's continue with the list of criteria. Number 3. Small acts of kindness, such as being given food, prompts a primitive gratitude for the gift of life, he explains. So, now we're forming a bond with the victim, the captive, and that's the same thing with your single mother, who you might as well coin as an abuser, because just by being a single mother, she's being abusive to her children by denying them half of what they need to grow up to be stable, productive adults in society. Single mothers, many single mothers are abusive, and yet they will perform small acts of kindness, okay, as a form of control, as a way of forming a bond with their child. Deprivation with little acts of kindness can form a very strong bond, a very strong codependent bond. Next criteria. The hostages experience a powerful, primitive, positive feeling toward their captors. They're in denial that this is the person who put them in that situation. Right. The captive becomes too reliant on that person for their emotional and physical well-being, to the point where that person does no wrong, can do no wrong, where they've been so deprived that any kindness that they get is 10, 100, 1,000 times more appreciated. So they develop this image of their mind as this person being almost like God, perfect and without flaw. And we see this in many of these stories we read from these male feminists, where they talk about how wrong abuse is and this and that. And they talk about abuse almost as if they suffered it, because they clearly did at the hands of their single mothers. But they don't come out and talk about it or in any way blame that mother. Instead, they lay the blame off on men. Other men, on society, on the patriarchy that controls everything. Now, let's continue with the story of the bank in Stockholm, Sweden, shall we? So, what went on in the bank on Stockholm's normal Storg Square that enabled the captives to experience positive feelings toward their captors despite fearing for their lives? Well, in a 2009 interview with Radio Sweden, Kristen Enmark, who was one of the captives, explained, "It's some kind of context you get into when all your values and the morals you have change in some way," right? It's a transformative experience because of the very specific circumstances of your captivity, which create a form of extreme attachment between you and your captors. It was Enmark that, according to reports, built up the strongest relationship with Olsen. There were even erroneous reports afterwards that the pair had become engaged. In one phone call from the bank's vault to the country's prime minister, Olof Palme, Enmark begged to be allowed to leave the bank with the kidnappers. Yikes. Talk about extreme attachment. One of Olsen's demands had been the delivery of a getaway car in which he planned to escape with the hostages. The authorities had refused. That's very, very interesting. Enmark goes on to say that she wasn't desperate because the kidnappers hadn't done anything to them. On the contrary, they were very nice to her. Of course, but you know, what she was scared of was that the police would attack and cause them to die. So now her mind, her fears have been shifted. She's not afraid of the kidnappers anymore. Now she fears the establishment, the patriarchy. The hostages spoke of being well treated by Olsen, and at the time it appeared that they believed they owed their lives to the criminal pair, he wrote. So it's very interesting. These hostages became so enamored with their captor, even though he obviously was the one who put them in danger. It's very clear that it doesn't take much to make people feel beholden to you, enamored with you, to change their entire worldview and way of thinking in a very short period of time. Imagine what this kind of treatment, but on a softer scale, will produce in a child by a mother. And the story goes on to say, and this is very interesting and telling, Olsen remarked at the beginning of the siege he could have easily killed the hostages, but that had changed over the days. So not only did the hostages' view of their captor change, but their captor's view of his hostages also changed. So we can very easily parallel this with a single mother. Angry, bitter, hateful. She expresses her feelings of attachment and motherly love to her child through negativity. Okay? She uses her son as a surrogate for all her pain and anger towards men. And yet, that in and of itself, over time, forms some kind of attachment where in some sick, twisted way, she cares about her son. Yes, she has initiated an attachment of caring, but using via negative means, via negative actions. But a bond has still been created, just like a bond was created between the captor and the captives in the Stockholm case. Article goes on to say, the notion that perpetrators can display positive feelings towards captives is a key element of Stockholm syndrome. Now let's go to the Patty Hearst case, shall we? And let's do a quick rundown of what she had to say about her confinement and how she was treated. Her said her confinement was part of the group's brainwashing strategy. They debilitate you by locking you up, she explained. You're deprived of sight, sleep, light, and food. You depend on them for all information, and the dread is just the threat that you'll constant threat that you'll be killed if you don't cooperate. Okay, so again, there's a reason I use the term soft Stockholm syndrome. But clearly, you do not need these type of extreme environments and extreme circumstances and extreme forms of treatment to achieve brainwashing. Okay? Especially when you're dealing with a child who's much weaker, who has a lower constitution, less stamina, less emotional stability, less emotional strength, who is much easier to manipulate and harm both emotionally and physically. So you only need a form of soft Stockholm syndrome. You don't need this kind of extreme treatment where you're deprived of sleep and food and everything else. All you need is to be deprived of approval, validation, love, and then sprinkled in there occasional acts of kindness. Now let's go over one other description of her captivity by someone who is relating what happened to Patty. During the time that Patty was held hostage, the SLA also began to brainwash her, and they set on turning her into an accomplice for their revolutionary and terrorist goals. Patty was abused both physically and psychologically, and later claimed that she was isolated to the point that she felt that no one would rescue her, and that she was sexually abused by various gang members. Additionally, Patty claimed that she was constantly exposed to the group's radical beliefs and was forced to record messages that would hurt her loved ones. So that's another thing that's key. While the single mother is withholding love and affection and emotionally abusing you and possibly physically abusing you, and the emotional abuse would be in the form of neglect, would be in the form of withholding love, withholding affection, constantly saying negative things about you, constantly telling you you're worthless, just like your worthless father, or your father was this, your father was that, associating you with the father. She'll also be filling your head with feminist nonsense. Feminism is a radical belief system that many people adhere to. It doesn't change the fact that it's radical. It's just been spread on a large scale. So, all you need to make a boy into a male feminist and a sufferer of soft Stockholm syndrome is a single mother who hates men. Gee, that's a tough one to find. And will emotionally abuse her child while at the same time feeling some form of affection for him as a mother, which of course is being expressed in a negative way, but occasionally her conscience, her or just circumstance itself will lead her to perform isolated acts of kindness, which, coupled with the extreme lack of emotional connection between the mother and the child, where he is so deprived of positive emotion and validation from his mother that any small act of kindness will seem 10, 100, 1,000-fold relevant and important in his mind, that he elevates her to some high point in his mind, as well as the ideas and the ideals and the crazy radical beliefs that she is constantly spewing about men and women. That's all you need. And I would argue that that is the case in many a single mother household. Single mother who is bitter and angry that her husband or her boyfriend or whatever left, dumped her ass, and she is angry. She is bitter, and she takes it out on the son, but it's still her son. So occasionally, to make up for the horrible treatment that she directs his way, which really she isn't even all that concerned about because he's a man after all, and society has taught women that men are less than, that women are superior than. So it's almost like a man has taken the position of a second-class citizen as a lesser form of subhuman person. So it's kind of okay to treat them badly, but she's still going to feel bad. So occasionally, she will, or just from, coincidence or circumstance, occasionally she's going to perform an act of kindness, do something nice for him. And he's going to be so grateful, like a starving man who hasn't had food in 2 months and you give him a Twinkie, or somebody, a man who's thirsty, who hasn't drank in days, and you give him water. He's so grateful. This man would give you everything for just a glass of water. He could be a rich man. He'd give you $1 billion for a glass of water. He's that grateful. Well, this child, so deprived, is going to give you their devotion. That's right. And will do anything for you, and will follow you anywhere, and will be so devoted to you. That's the Stockholm Syndrome in a nutshell, and that's what Patty Hearst suffered from, and that's what the people in that bank vault in Stockholm suffered from, and that is what male feminists suffer from. Because everything they believe is against their own best interest. It's 100% completely, totally irrational for a man to be a feminist. And yet they are. And oftentimes they are some of the most die-hard feminists. Almost like they have been brainwashed. That's because they have been brainwashed. Because growing up in a single mother household oftentimes is a form of brainwashing. So that is all I have to say on the subject at this time. That male feminists are victims of a soft form of Stockholm Syndrome. Let me know what you think in the comments section. Please like and subscribe and donate to my Patreon if you like this video and find my content to be useful and enjoyable. You'll find a link in the description and in the last 20 seconds of this video. I am the MGTOW Philosopher, and I wish you a good day. Take care.